AI companies like OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, Meta, et cetera, are starting to come under fire for how their AI tools have been trained. So, one high profile example of this that happened recently is that Reddit just announced it would charge for API access. So, the ability to connect to their services from third party apps in order to use their data in various ways, this will now be charged for. And one of the main motivations here is that Reddit is one of the big sites often scraped to get data to train language models. So, they're trying to stop AI companies from training models on Reddit data without compensating Reddit. They've been very clear and vocal about that. Twitter recently made a very similar move. They started charging for API access, and Elon Musk has publicly threatened to sue Microsoft for, he says, quote, illegally using Twitter data to train models. So, on top of all this, an investigative report by the Washington Post just came out that found that large language models from Google and Meta trained on data from many major websites. Now, historically, we just weren't sure exactly what sites were being trained on. So, they found that websites like Wikipedia, the New York Times, Kickstarter, many others were used to train these models. Now, here's the issue: it's not necessarily always a problem to be using a website to train a model, but the report found that there was data being used from certain sites that could create some serious issues. So, in one example, the Post found that these models had trained on data from an ebook piracy site. So, they're training on books that they have access to, but don't probably have the permission to use. Additionally, the copyright symbol, that little C within the circle, appeared more than 200 million times in the data that the Post studied, basically pointing the finger at and confirming the fact that these models have, in some cases, used copyrighted data in order to train their outputs. So let's first talk about these companies restricting API access. What kind of impact do you see this having on companies that develop these models?
They're gonna pay more for the data. I mean, the companies that are the source of the training data wanna get paid, and it's a very logical play. So if you have data that is that valuable to them, then it makes sense that you wanna get paid for it. The average, like, corporate brand or blogger, you know, you're not gonna probably this isn't gonna change how you do what you do. But, in theory, as a marketer, as a company, you create a bunch of content and you put it out there for free, and you allow Google to index it so it shows up in the search results, and the value exchange, the consideration from a legal perspective is, we're gonna send you traffic for your data.
Mm,
Now the question becomes, the bigger thing that all of us are trying to figure out is, well, if the language model is used to build a chat interface that just answers the question, and they're using our data to answer that question, but no one ever comes to our site anymore,
mm.
where's the value exchange? That's the great debate about what is the future of search and SEO. It's like we're just creating all this content still, and nobody's finding it from organic search. Um, but we're not going to solve that on this podcast episode. So yeah, I think the basic takeaway here is if you've got proprietary data, you're either going to train your own model like Cora did. You're going to just train a language model of your own, or you're going to charge for the data, or maybe it's both. But yeah, I think it's a natural outcome that these companies with the data want to get paid for the data that's using to train the models.
So it's not the first time, as they are training models on this data, that we've heard concerns around copyright, but it does seem like we are confirming or proving that at least some of these models are being trained on copyrighted material. Now, I mean, realistically, what could happen here? We've seen lawsuits, we'll probably see more, but are they going to be able to shut down? Are companies going to be able to shut down these models from training on this data?
I don't I don't think so. Not a lawyer. Took business law in college. That's about the extent of my lawyering. Paid a lot of legal bills through my years for IP related stuff. So I've spent enough time in my career working on intellectual property stuff to be, you know, educated in the space, but certainly not a lawyer. My guess has always been they're going to pay massive penalties at some point. Like
Mm,
at some point, it's going to kind of come down to this. But I think that the key for you as a marketer or business leader is, and I've actually heard this come up in some recent conversations with organizations, is your generative AI policies, you and your responsible AI principles in your company, you have to address the fact that you may be using technology that was built illegally,
Mm,
and you have to make sure you're okay with that. Like, this isn't you're not gonna get in trouble. So if you go use OpenAI GPT-4 in your company and you're using it to, like, generate ideas and outlines and some drafts for things or whatever it is, are you gonna get sued because you use GPT-4? Again, not legal advice, but I can't fathom a scenario where that occurs.
mhm,
However, they may get sued, and it will likely be found that they did. The thing I just referenced, that like Google knew that copyright was going to be an issue because their models were probably trained on some stuff that it shouldn't have been trained on. Um, so, are you going to choose not to use large language models if it becomes obvious that they were in fact built on some illegal data? Again, my guess is no. Like, I
mm,
don't see this changing the trajectory. I do think it's gonna impact in Europe, like we talked already about Italy, and
yep,
I think others are gonna follow on the GDPR, because one of the issues I saw brought up last week, and I don't know if it was a tweet, so unfortunately, I'm sorry, I can't cite it, but, um, it was saying that one of the issues they're gonna run into in Europe is that you have to, and I think even related to GDPR, you have to be able to, request your data back or
mm,
not be used. Well, if it's trained on something I put out into the world, they can't go into that language model and get Paul's training data out of it. So the fact that they can't adhere to the law might be a problem. So I do think that the way they build these models is going to have to evolve. I could see that being a scenario where it ends up that new regulations make it kind of illegal to train it the way they have. Maybe they pay a fine for past issues, maybe they don't. But I do think there's going to be a scenario where they have to reimagine how these language models are trained.
mm,
And I think the answer in the near term for most corporations is going to be you're going to train custom versions of these models, where it's going to be trained largely on your own data moving forward. Now, the foundational model might be an issue. So, like, for example, one of the ways you could see this being solved is through one of the things we're going to talk about, stable LM, like these
mhm,
language models that are open source foundational models. Well, those open source language models may have the exact same issue and likely do have the exact same issue as these other ones. So I would say it's just, as a marketer or business leader who's listening to this podcast, there's no real action to take here other than an awareness that the models you're going to be using likely have some legal cases that we're going to hear about over the next 10 years around how they're trained.
mm,
I don't think it's going to affect what you're going to do day to day with them, other than the fact that, um, either way, you're likely going to be building custom versions of these models for your company where you're really confident that all of your proprietary data is going to remain yours and not go into some future version of the language model. So your data is not training their models. Um, I think that's going to happen with or without this other stuff playing out in courts, but lots of lawyering ahead is what I would say.